Welcome everyone to this presentation about pharaonic power in Egypt and the influence of geography on the country. To begin with, I'm going to use a quote from Pamela Bradley, a well-published historian, who said, "The Nile River and sun were two great forces which dominated the lives of ancient Egyptians. Their gifts of water, fertile soil, and warmth created life. On the other, they had the potential to bring destruction and death." This quote from historian and author Pamela Bradley effectively sums up the interaction of the Egyptian people with their geography. Like many primitive peoples, the Egyptians explained the power of natural forces, such as the Nile, through personification and deification. The god the Egyptians believed powered the Nile was this fellow, Hapi. Again typical of historic peoples, the Egyptians believed that the gods needed placating in order to ensure their care. In this hymn to Hapi, or hymn to the Nile, the Egyptians highlight the beneficial effects of the Nile and its flood, as well as highlighting the effects of a god who may well be displeased. This map gives a sense of the vital role that the Nile played in ancient Egypt. Both a highway and a source of water, the Nile runs from the Ethiopian highlands in the south to the Mediterranean Sea in the north. It is divided into two distinct zones, the Nile Delta region, known as Lower Egypt, i.e. it's lower in the Nile catchment, and the Nile River Valley, known as Upper Egypt. This photograph gives a sense of the Nile Valley as it may have looked in Upper Egypt during antiquity. A narrow, fertile valley floor surrounded on either side by desert. At its narrowest point, a few hundred metres. At its widest, 10 to 15 kilometres. Lower Egypt, by way of contrast, is depicted here, largely flat, with meandering channels. The 12 mouths of the Nile flatten out here in the delta to be marshy wetlands. Quite a distinct atmosphere to that of the river valley. The Egyptians simply referred to the Nile as Iteru, meaning the river. The Nile itself represents the confluence of the Blue Nile and the White Nile, as depicted in this map. In the south, the border of Egypt with its southern neighbour, now known as Sudan, is Elephantine, where the river is punctuated by a series of cataracts, where shallow or rough waters are broken by rocks and small islands. These 6 points formed a natural defence against river-borne invasion. One prominent feature of the Nile is the Fayum oasis, found on the western bank in Lower Egypt, in a slight depression. It was largely undeveloped until later periods. The delta of the Nile opens up into multiple openings, as shown here. Each has a name, so for example, people will refer to the Canopic branch of the Nile. The Egyptians conceived of the Nile as being a giant lotus flower with a long stem growing down, the bud of the flower being the Fayum, and the bloom being the delta. Probably the most famous feature of the Nile was its flood, shown here in an early 20th century photograph. The flood was an annual and reliable event which would occur in June, August and September every year. The arrival was made apparent by a change in water colour from green to muddy brown and would be preceded by low water in May. The Egyptians became highly evolved in measuring the flood, developing marker points along the river valley in which they measured the height, known as Nilometers. They knew that a flood was set up of about 7¼ metres was the ideal, which would bring with it rich silt which would settle on the flooded plains. 8 metres above was dangerous, bringing destruction to towns and moving too quickly to effectively silt the land. At 6 metres, vast swathes of the valley would not flood, leaving the land unreplenished with the vital silt. The flood, the silt, and the life-giving waters made Egyptians often refer to their land as the gift of the Nile. So to recap, the Nile flood was annual. Happened in June, August and September. It began by showing green, then muddy brown. It was lowest in May. They measured it with nilometers. 7¼ metres was ideal, 8 metres dangerous, and 6 metres too low. It brought with it rich black silt, which gave fertility to the land, and Egyptians therefore often referred to their country as the gift of the Nile. This is a depiction of one of the famous Nilometers, the devices used by priests to measure the height and force of the annual inundation. This one is at the priestly centre of Aswan. The effect of the annual flood was profound. The Egyptian year was divided into seasons based on the flood. Akhet, the inundation, was the season of the flood. After this, Peret was the growing, during which time the seeds germinated and were grown in the milder winter months. During the heat of summer, or Shimu, the harvest was brought in. The Egyptians also had names for the distinct zones of their land. The black lands of the river valley and delta were known as Kemet. The deserts of the east and west were known as Deshret. Upper Egypt was known by the Egyptians as Shemau, and the lower as Tomehu. Each had its own distinct character. On the eastern and western borders were deserts, natural defensive barriers. In the south, the cataracts, and in the north, the delta, all provided barriers against invasion or attack. It is considered that the very existence of Egypt was to take advantage of the Nile, but also as a response to the flooding. The above quote highlights a theory of civilization known as adversity theory. It is suggested that a civilization which lacked a particular problem to deal with would fail to advance at the same rate as one that was without the problem. In the case of Egypt, the adversity was dealing with the flood and its impact. It is generally believed that prehistoric Egypt was far wetter and more lush than what it would eventually become. The challenge to the early settlers into the valley would then be how to manage the ever-diminishing water availability and therefore the lesser supply of fertile land. Drawing water from the river was easy enough, but channeling water for irrigation was much more of a challenge. It is thought that the challenge of building and annually rebuilding the channels needed to irrigate the valley led to a need for leadership and coordination. This would sow the seeds of the roles that would eventually develop into the position that we will call Pharaoh. Far from being just simple channels, the Egyptians had a complex series of basins, dikes, and levees which were needed to provide water to the fields. The Egyptians devised a simple but effective means of lifting water into areas where the river sat beneath the plain, known as the shaduf, which was essentially a large bucket with a lever and a counterbalance. The Nile would also provide an easy avenue for transportation for the Egyptians. Headed upstream, a boat could set sail and use prevailing winds to move. The boat shown in this picture is a traditional Egyptian boat called a felucca. Oars and the current could be used to move downstream, as is shown in this archaic Egyptian image of a Nile boat. The division of the Nile Valley into Kemet and Deshret would also lead to the conception of the lands of the living and the lands of the dead. Here the city of Abydos shows the lands of the living along the river, and the dead lands into the west. The term going into the west was for the Egyptians a way of saying to die. So in summation now, the Egyptian calendar was entirely shaped by the Nile. Life in Egypt was completely dependent on the Nile. In a desert country with no discernible rainfall, water from the Nile was their only chance. Transport and communication would be shaped by the Nile. Egypt would be seen as the gift of the Nile. Religion and belief would be shaped by the Nile. And eventually, dealing with the Nile would provide them with the challenge which would give rise to leadership. This is the end of this presentation.